Welcome to Unit 4.1.1, which is the first lecture in the series on planning law. And this lecture covers planning law and policy, so it's just a general introduction to the structures and frameworks that govern planning in Ireland. So just a word about Unit 4 itself. On planning, the content that it will cover will be the planning process. So that's this lecture on planning law and policy. Then followed by a lecture on definitions and the planning application process at local authority level, followed by information about the appeals process to onboard Panola. And then this is followed by a series of two videos on judicial review parts 1 and 2, that look at how the courts supervise and oversee the county council and onboard Panola level planning applications. So back to this lecture's topic, the planning process in broad outline, or the planning framework. So the planning process consists of an application to county council level. So you apply when you're making a residential planning application, for example, or even a factory application, you apply to your local county council first. And you go through the processes that we're going to look at in the second video on this topic. And then if you are unhappy with the outcome, you're refused, you can appeal the county council decision to onboard Panola. Now, certain types of applications skip the county council stage and go straight to onboard Panola. Examples of these are strategic infrastructure decisions, so decisions about large infrastructural projects that are considered to be of strategic importance to the state. Shannon LNG, or Shannon Liquid Natural Gas Terminal in Shannon, was an example of one of those projects that was allowed to skip the county council level and go straight to onboard Panola, because it was considered in the interest of securing the fuel security of the state to have a liquid natural gas terminal in Ireland. And both these decision-making processes, the application to county council stage and the onboard Panola stage, are overseen by the High Court. So you can review in the High Court decisions of the county council in their planning function, and also decisions of onboard Panola. So you don't have to go through both stages before you go to the High Court. You can go to the High Court from the county council if there's a flaw in the county council process, or you can go through the onboard Panola appeal and then review the whole process in the High Court through judicial review. So we look at judicial review later in two videos on judicial review. So what is the planning framework in Ireland? It's governed by legislation. So county councils are public bodies. They can only act based on legislation that gives them powers to act. And in this case, the powers are given to them by the Planning and Development Act 2000. This act fundamentally reformed and consolidated planning law in Ireland. Before that, we were using piecemeal legislation that had been floating around since the 1960s that was really fragmented and really difficult to follow, and also inadequate to the task of providing a coherent planning framework that, achieved all the objectives that we wanted to achieve in terms of our climate obligations and proper planning and sustainable development. So the Planning and Development Act 2000 introduced the concept of sustainable development for the first time, even though it wasn't a new concept in 2000, it had been around since the 70s. And it also introduced a more strategic approach. So rather than planning policy basically varying from county council area to county council area, and really variable decision making all over the country, resulting in really incoherent, architectural policies, and also, really jarring differences in structures in local areas, but also a lack of consistency for people who were trying to use the system as well. So this system was a big improvement. So it took a broader approach. So it provides for different timescale and geographic level frameworks. So first of all, the countrywide framework of the National Planning Framework that has a 10 to 20 year lifespan, provided for in Chapter 2A of the Planning and Development Act 2000. And then sort of sub-level below that, the country is divided into 4 regions that have their own strategies that have to comply with the National Planning Framework, but they can have their own variations based on the particular features of those regional areas. So they're regional, spatial and economic strategies. And they last for 12 to 20 years, so within the framework of the National Planning Framework, within that 20-year time frame. And they're provided for in Chapter 3 of the Planning and Development Act 2000. And then local planning authorities, so the county council area, can have their development plan, which you may be familiar with. You may have participated in even your local development plans review. They're reviewed every 6 years and by the planning authority. Within the development plan area, you might have specific strategic development zones. So there are special quick planning processes for strategically important developments, like the Adamstown housing development in Dublin during the 2001 housing crisis. It proved to be really controversial, but it's an example of that SDZ process, and they're still being used right now. And we have a new process as well, the strategic housing development process, where applications made directly to the minister as well. Local area plans then, so the local authorities are able to make local area plans, so LAPs, they fall within the development plans. They must match up with the development plan. They must also match up with the regional spatial and economic strategy and the national planning framework, and they are for towns with a population of 2,000 plus at the last census, and they last for 6 years. And then finally we have development contribution schemes. So for different local areas, the county council set out what the planning contributions are that will be requested. So if you want to build a house in a particular area, you should be able to look up the development contribution scheme and see how much you'll have to give the county council to pay for services like the putting in of roads and lighting and sewerage and all that kind of stuff that goes along with developing houses in a particular area. So if you're making a large development, multi-unit, 200 housing estate with a block of 50 apartments, that's going to require a lot of services to be put in by the county council and for them to take in charge the roads and common areas of that estate once it's finished. So they want money for that, for their part in that, and that will be quite hefty for a large development contribution, which will be set out in the scheme. So the Planning and Development Acts then, so the legislation itself is constantly changing. Every few months there's a new amendment to the Act. So here are the best sources to find a kind of coherent version of them. So the Planning and Development Act 2000, updated to January 2021. So this is an unofficial consolidation. That means it's not officially legislation. So what it is the Law Reform Commission have put together the jigsaw puzzle of all of the hundreds of amendments to the Planning Act since the year 2000 into one piece of coherent legislation where you can read it all together. And also then under the Planning and Development Act there are regulations that set out the detailed procedures for the Act, and they are available from the government website assets.gov.ie in a consolidated form as well, updated to February 2021. And so it's important to remember that the Planning Acts change constantly. So even these unofficial consolidations, even though they're issued by government bodies, before you advise anyone on them or take a decision yourself based on them, you should check them against irishstatutebook.ie to see have there been any changes since the last update to the consolidated version, and indeed check the consolidated version against them if you're to be really thorough as well, because you want to make sure their law is correct that you're working off of, and it is tricky. Planning is tricky because the legislation is so difficult to piece together and difficult to follow. So national planning framework then, so this is, as we were saying before, the state level or the country level plan that governs how development should be carried out in the state. So it establishes a broad national plan for government in relation to strategic planning and sustainable development of urban and rural areas. It's supposed to provide for balanced regional development that maximises the potential of the different regions. And it's supposed to enable coordination of the regional spatial strategies. So as we said, that's a 10 to 20 year plan for the whole country. The regional spatial and economic strategy then, as we were saying, is a 12 to 20 year plan for one of the four regions, the northern and western region, the southern region, the eastern and the Midlands. So you can see those regions here, or rather 3 regions I should have said, before if we had the 6 counties. So the northern and western region is all of these counties here on the upper left hand side of the map. So Donegal, Monaghan, Cavan, Leitrim, Sligo, Roscommon, Galway. The eastern and Midland region, which Athlone IT is in Westmeath, Longford, Offaly, Laois, Kildare, Wicklow, Dublin, Meath and Louth. And then the southern region as well, with Cork, Kerry, Limerick, Clare and the other bottom half of the country, counties like Waterford, Wexford, Kilkenny and Carlow. So the regional spatial strategy provides a spatial strategy to manage future growth and ensure the creation of healthy and attractive places to live, work, study and invest. Economic strategy that's supposed to help businesses develop a metropolitan plan to ensure that cities develop correctly, and particularly Dublin. An investment framework to prioritise the enabling of key infrastructure and services by the government. So they're supposed to predict where services will be needed based on demographics and make plans for that investment in the future. And then also a climate action strategy to accelerate climate action and to ensure a clean and healthy environment and to promote sustainable transport and strategic green infrastructure. It's important to note that separate to this, under the Climate Act 2015, Ireland is obliged to produce a long-term strategy and a national climate and energy plan under European law that plans for reducing emissions to net zero by 2050. And that is really important in terms of planning. So all planning strategy should accord with the Climate Act objectives as well. So these policies all have to kind of fall within the climate objectives too. And there's a new climate bill coming out now, the Climate Act 2020, or the Climate Bill 2020, which is being processed through the Parliament at the moment, but has been highly criticised. But anyway. So the Regional Spatial Strategy will be informed by Project Ireland 2040, the National Planning Framework, the National Development Plan. Those two things together are Project Ireland 2040. And also the National Climate Mitigation Plan as well, which was struck down in a recent court case. There will be a new one of those coming out soon under the new Climate Act. The consultation process, so initial public and stakeholder consultation, engagement through collaboration with key stakeholders, technical working groups, senior official advisory groups, a socio-economic profile of each region, and a map, geographical and economic map of each area. There'll be a strategic environmental assessment, or SEA. So this is like an EIS, it's like an environmental impact statement, only on a huge scale, strategic scale. And there'll be appropriate assessment of any habitats impacts, flood risk assessment, and they all supply environmental information that influence the making of the Regional Spatial Strategy. So we have the Southern Regional Assembly, which is 33 councillors appointed to an assembly of the Southern Region from 27 constituent local authorities, and 6 by virtue of their membership of the committees of the regions. These are not directly elected but nominated by their local authorities. And the councillors are supported by staff of the Assembly and based in the Assembly headquarters in Waterford City. So the geographical areas within the Southern Regional Assembly are the South East Region, so Carlow, Tipperary, Waterford, Wexford, Kilkenny, South West Region, Cork and Kerry, Midwest, Clare, Limerick and County Tipperary. And then you have the North and West Regional Assembly, so these are all the county councils in the North and Western Region. So similar to the Southern Regional Assembly, similar structure, and then similarly for the Eastern and Midland for that other third, which we are in Athlone here. And so the Eastern and Midland Regional Assembly with its representatives from Dublin, from Eastern and from Midlands counties. Before the 2000 Development Act, or the 2000 Planning Act, I should say, the law was governed by the Local Government Planning and Development Acts 1963 to 1999, and they no longer cover the area, although there's some operative provisions still in operation, so you kind of have to watch out for that. It was a piecemeal framework with a local approach to planning that varied drastically from local area to local area, and there were lots and lots of regulations made under it, some of which still remain in force at the moment. And it was very fragmented. That was the main problem. The Planning and Development Act was supposed to consolidate all of the law and kind of nationalise it, so make a coherent national framework as well as regional frameworks. And it tried its best to do that. And there's been several major amendments. So these are the major amendments. There have been a lot of smaller amendments as well that aren't listed here. So the 2002, the 2006 Strategic Infrastructure Act that set up that strategic infrastructure projects that can apply directly to Onboard Penola. The Planning and Development Act 2010, which made huge changes, and the Environmental Miscellaneous Provisions, that should say, Act 2011, which made certain costs provisions for environmental court cases that are in the public interest. The planning regulations as well have been amended multiple times, that should say 2001 to 2020. They're comprehensive regulations dealing with many specific areas of planning. So when you want to find out how to make a planning application, it's the regulations you go to. They set out what the form is, how you fill it out, what needs to be in it, what the accompanying documentation are, what the site notice is, what needs to be in the site notice, where the site notice needs to go, for how long, what's the newspaper notice that needs to be submitted, and all of that stuff. And then they set out the criteria that will govern the application, the environmental information that will be considered, how to do the EIS, all of that stuff is all in the regulations. So they're they're much more detailed and voluminous than the acts and much more complex. So that's the planning framework in Ireland and the policy and legislative